Thank you everyone for coming. I love this book. I've wanted to read it for an awful long time, and I'm glad you were the one to write it.
Thank you.
Kind of book, it's kind of wild that this has never been written before.
Right, yeah, a lot of what's in it has been published here or there, usually in a zine or somewhere that very few people would have seen. And in a couple of cases, books that didn't get much distribution. So, yeah, and it was certainly a lot of work, but a lot of fun to put it together and to kind of see it in a line. Also, seeing the index for the first time when I got the finished book was fun, because it was like my brain dumped onto a page and in alphabetical order.
That was a real fun part about seeing the finished book as opposed to the
Right.
advance, was like seeing the index and like,
Yes.
I kept looking up all these artists to see, like, I wonder if they're mentioned in here, like, people that we spent a lot of time thinking about in 94 or 95 or whatever. I was like, I wonder if Votech made the book. Like, it's like,
Oh, man. Votech probably should have made the
is
book.
Votech here? Good. Okay. But just as a history of this incredibly sweeping and sprawling genre, it fills a huge need.
Thank you. I'm going to read a short passage. It's from the Electroclash chapter, because we're in New York City. It's going to be two different portions, sort of asynchronous. Casey Spooner moved from Manhattan to Williamsburg in the summer of 2011, near Bedford Avenue. Everything moved from Manhattan to Williamsburg then, he says. Spooner lived around the corner from the recently opened Lux. Lux was a random Latin cowboy bar in Williamsburg, says Shaniza Muhammad, who knew Larry T. from Limelight. A couple years prior, I'd rented out that space for my 25th birthday party. Spooner threw a housewarming party that spilled over to Larry T. and Spencer Products' new Saturday night Lux party called Berliniumsburg. Casey's birthday party launched it, acknowledges T. At that point in New York nightlife, partying in Brooklyn wasn't done. Berliniumsburg signaled a reverse migration. More and more young Manhattanites were flocking to Williamsburg to live as well as party. T and Product took over Lux's Fridays as well, calling the party Mutants. It wasn't just straight or gay, though the gay pickup thing kept it financially feasible, says T. But everybody came because it was such an exciting new happening. There was little left in Manhattan anyway. Twilo shut permanently on May 24th, 2001, after the state voted to allow the city of New York to not renew the venue's cabaret license. Authorities had discovered the club was sending overdose victims to the hospital using its own specially hired paramedic service, so as not to alert the police. And after first attempting to revive them with ice water in a private back room. The day the club shut down, fans conducted a vigil. People gathered around and took photos, hugging each other and bidding farewell, Tricia Romano wrote in the Village Voice. A few cried and some danced to the music booming from a silver car parked at the curb. Manhattan's early 90s vogue for sit-down lounges such as Spy had introduced a queasy new concept, bottle service. They were small places initially, says Frank Owen. Club owners started doing the math. You're not going to make a fortune if you have 100, 200 people in there. Promoters said, why don't we do this in a bigger club and we'll make a fucking killing. We can sell a $30 bottle of vodka for $500. Tommy Sunshine arrived in New York with David Alter and Ryan Paradise of St. Louis's Superstars of Love. The Superstars of Love, FYI, were a St. Louis crew who dressed in very outlandish disco clothing, and in 2001, like many, many other people, sort of abandoned the rave thing for the electro thing. Like a lot of people around the I just repeated myself here. Like a lot of people around the U.S., they had defected from the Raven Club scene to the nervy new electro sound. In Chicago, Sunshine would start Electro Sweat with Detroit native Jordan Zawada at Red Dog, later moving it to Smart Bar and renaming it Degeneration. The Superstars had recently signed to International DJ Gigolos Records alongside Fisher Spooner and Crossover, who both played Exit during the first Electroclash festival in 2001. on. All of them hewed to the new aesthetic promulgated by Vice magazine. Though it ran surprisingly deep reporting, its bread and butter was slickly produced cheap provocation, defined visually by Terry Richardson's starkly lit perv shots and Ryan McGinley's looking for America with my rich naked junkie friends scenarios, and by the infamous do's and don'ts, street fashion photos with captions like coked up verbal drive-bys, written by founding editor Gavin McInnes. Richardson, McGinley, and McInnes were all regulars at Lux. Hedy Slimane from Dior and Dolce & Gabbana would come down, says Larry T. Kim Jones used to come from London, and now he's head of men's at Louis Vuitton. It was a real cultural moment of a new generation, a new aesthetic, the beginning of Hipsterville. Vice was Hipsterville's house organ. A cosign gave you instant cred. The final issue of 2001 paid tribute to the album that called its tune. On the cover, in construction stencil lettering, was a lyric from Felix de Housecat's Kittens and the Glitz. Happy hour, sun shower, 808s give you power. Tommy Sunshine, their author, was thrilled. If Vice was the scene's Bible, its sacrament was cocaine, which had replaced MDMA as the New York clubbers' drug of choice. In Williamsburg, people acquired it by going to the bar Cokies, whose name was about as subtle as a leather jacket or a mullet or a porn stash. How the fuck do you keep open a business called Cokies that sells coke, says Tommy Sunshine, still amazed. It stayed open until 2005. Ecstasy had encouraged plur-style egolessness. Cocaine was egocentric, just the thing for a culture throwing off Rave's now rote anonymity.
I love the New York electroclash culture, I guess because it's the only part of the book where I was actually like a witness to any of the incredibly like fun and decadent things you described.
Right, yes.
So almost all the scenes you're describing throughout the book are things that
Is that your neighborhood right around there?
Yes. And Lux was awesome. The first time I danced with my wife was at Lux.
Really?
Yes.
So when did you move to that neighborhood?
WIT show. I moved there in the summer 2002.
Ah, okay.
Berliniumsburg was already a thing. It is impossible not to smile when you say the word Berliniumsburg. It's just a beautiful thing.
It's like what Michael Stipe said about shiny, happy people. He deliberately made all of the vowel sounds wide so that you had to smile while you sang it.
It seems like connecting these different scenes, these different things going on at different times in different parts of the world, it seems like that is just a gargantuan undertaking in itself.
Sort of, but not. I mean, it was harder. It would have been easier to do that worldwide than in America in some ways because the global dance scene has been historicized quite a lot. Everybody knows the stories of what happened in Ibiza and London. There are books on Berlin. There's a couple of really good books on Berlin. A great oral history of the fall of the wall through the mid-90s called Der Klang der Familie, and which is also in English now. And Tobias Rapp's book on what he calls the EasyJet set. And the EasyJet set are the clubbers who in the 2000s started to take, cheap commercial jet airlines from wherever they were in Europe to Berlin for the weekend. They could just fly in and out in a couple of hours, and that became kind of its own tourist industry. But in America, there was nothing like that. It was pretty much the domain of the people who were there, or people who wrote zines, or people who posted to mailing lists. So a lot of the work of the book was combing those mailing lists, combing the zines, and talking to a lot of people to try to figure out, what was at least plausible. And there was a lot of combing through plausibility in order to get some of these stories straight. A really good example of that is the New Orleans bust in 2000, because when I got to that chapter, I realized to my horror that I had 0 actual eyewitnesses in the building. just people who had seen it from outside, Disco Donnie, whose party it was, being one of them. So that took a couple of weeks of hustling and finding people. And the guy I leaned on the most ended up being the lighting technician of DJ Monk named Berkeley Mayer, and he had this very sober, clear, no BS account of it that I frankly trusted a little more than some of the more hyperbolic things I was hearing about that particular evening.
I guess this connects to something that I was thinking a lot about during the book. Is it different for you as a historian writing about the events / scenes that you were actually there for, part of?
Yeah, but I mean, in some way I was there for some of this stuff. Like, I went to a lot of Midwest parties. I've been to a few of the things that I write about in shorter passages, but not necessarily for the, the parties that I wrote chapters about. There were a couple of chapters I cut, and one of them was the first Further in 1994. I actually attended that. I was awake for 3 days. I had to go to bed 10 minutes into Aphex Twin because I was exhausted, so I missed David Prince dancing naked on the speaker stack. But I also, I knew that it wasn't going to just be my personal history of anything. Like, my personal history of this is not a book. It's maybe it's a chapbook. I wasn't in the center of things, and I never thought I was, and that was always important to sort of convey that. It's very deliberately not in first person, very deliberately. Like, even the scenes I'm in, which come toward the end, are not in first person because it would break it. But also because, this is a rich topic. There's a lot of eyewitnesses to these things, and they really, in some cases, just had these jaw-dropping things to say that I relished quoting, and had to leave out quite a lot of amazing stuff, I just wanted the book to go forward.
You got so many amazing quotes from people who, I guess, I had no idea that they had such amazing stories and ways of expressing it. One of the kind of poignant things that runs through the book is how spread out these different scenes were. Like you said, not being in the center of things. I guess something I didn't really fully grok until this book was how so much of this is spread out in different pockets around the North American continent, and people being the only people in their town who are interested in this stuff. And I guess the sort of so different from the European thing where it's like these
Right.
cities that are all pretty accessible to each other.
Right, they're accessible to each other, and there's a network of clubs. There are clubs that allow this stuff to happen, that encourage this stuff. And in America, you didn't find those clubs so much. And there is a great deal of true belief that powers that scene. It had to be that way. And it's usually just, one thing I definitely found, and even talking to people who are in smaller towns that did only make it into the book in a glancing way, this guy James Johnson, there's two James Johnsons in the Midwest scene, the one in Chicago who I didn't talk to, and the one in Columbus, I believe, who I did talk to. And that was a perfect instance of, it was a small scene, so I couldn't give it a lot of space, but it really informed what I was doing, because here's a guy who got the bug, helped put it in motion, and then when the cops decided enough was enough, that was it. And that was in 1998 then. I should say. So yeah, you see a lot of that. You see a lot of, like, the only jungle DJ in town. A lot of that kind of stuff. Just like, I remember actually Details magazine in the late 90s had a feature on I think it was the only jungle DJ in Knoxville. And it was poignant. It was like 3,000 words about this guy's lonely quest. But I felt like, one of the other things with this is that they're not necessarily lonely quests. They got validated after a while, but it's funny to think, I remember after I talked to Kurt X, who was in Milwaukee and put on the Further parties and was the head of the Drop Bass Network, which was probably, outside of Richie Houghton, the most consistent and popular Midwest rave crew. he wrote to me after we had talked, and he was like, it was bittersweet for him to see all of this stuff happening, because he got out in the mid-2000s. Like, he saw the writing on the wall. He had skirted the law so many times. Like, he'd watched other people take the punishment that was intended for him from law enforcement, and he got out and didn't get back in, didn't pull a Gary Richards, who got back into the promoting after 15 years absence. And Kurt was really one of the good guys. He really was a straight shooter. He was a good businessman. He was not out, he had a really good reputation, and in that scene, that's hard to get and hard to maintain, and he managed to do it for a decade. So it's bittersweet for him to see what he could have maybe done if he'd stuck around a bit or kept dabbling. And I feel like I encountered that a fair amount too.
It seems that way. It seems it's something. I promise not to keep coming back to the word poignant, but how many people have the story of they were fighting? I guess the physical toll that this takes, just in terms of the stamina, but also the
also the drugs.
Violence. Yeah, the drugs, and but also just the violence. How many fights and how many extraordinarily violent cop busts?
Yeah, and that really takes hold later. That's not, from what I gather at least, not a heavy feature earlier on, because at that point, particularly with Grave, the party that Kurt didn't put on but was in Milwaukee, and so got busted, and nearly 1,000 people arrested, most of whom are let off because the police literally don't know what MDMA is, and they've busted the party for drinking. They've made the tickets in advance for teen drinking, and they literally leave thousands of dollars of ecstasy stuffed into the cracks of the walls. That sort of thing wasn't as prevalent. They were just busting a teen drinking party again. We've done this before. They didn't know what they were up against. And a lot of that later, jerky is a considerable understatement, but the Utah bust in 2005 that I talk about, where it's the helicopters, and it's on YouTube, and it's just horrifying to watch. It's revenge. They're really angry. They got hoodwinked. Cops don't like that. Cops don't like it when they end up having zero power.
Yeah. Also, I guess cops must have been drawn to it for the same reason the criminal elements were drawn to it, that this was not a violent scene and seemed probably an easy score.
Oh yeah, for sure. The line about how, ravers were simple, they were easy to pick on if you were a criminal. And yeah, it's true. But also it was part and parcel of the drug war, for sure. They were used to or at least they'd seen on TV in some of the smaller towns, this is the way you bust a bunch of hardened criminals with drugs and guns, and in this case, it was a bunch of kids with sock hats and fat pants who had a bunch of pills.
One of the comic highlights of the book, and there are many, but something that's in retrospect hard to even believe that this happened. Joe Biden and his
Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy, the RAVE Act. It didn't go through. It got put on the table, lost a couple of sponsors, was taken off. This is in 2002, and then a year later in 2003, a modified version of it was tacked onto the Amber Alert bill. And it basically fined everyone involved with putting on an event. If somebody was taking MDMA on your watch in any capacity, whether you were a promoter or a property owner or a venue manager, you were getting a 5-figure fine or more.
Amazing. Where there's nothing comparable for I guess the fact that it's so genre specific and it's really
they called it the RAVE Act.
Yeah, the RAVE Act. In terms of the stereotypical, the man trying to bust the music. It's hard to think of anything comparable to this in this country.
Right, yeah. Like they didn't try to outlaw rock and roll. There were ordinances that were targeted for specific venues for jazz and for any kind of black music. But I guess in a way, the irony there is that so much of this music is rooted in black American music, and yet so many people who are not involved in the scene don't think of it that way. They don't think that it's black music. They think it's European. So this is actually the one thing they actually tried, that the government actually put their foot down about. They didn't do it with jazz. They didn't do it with hip hop. They didn't do it with rock and roll. They didn't do it with anything that was perceived in their public scare moments as black music, and yet it was.
It's amazing. Like all these busts, you mentioned the Milwaukee one, the New Orleans one, the Utah one. It's amazing how. And I guess a lot of people from the scene, just the sort of the toll that takes on them, that people burning out of the scene with just...
Oh yeah, I remember when the 90s, when I was going to parties every weekend in the Twin Cities, and you could and I was a straight edge, and so you could really see... You could watch the toll being taken on certain individuals. You could see somebody who'd come to the party for the first time and they were the most exuberant dancer, and then within 2 months they weren't coming anymore because they were in rehab. Wow. That was not uncommon at all.
Is that something, it's weird how often that sort of story, there are a lot of stories in the book that repeat themselves through the book.
Yes. Yes, dance music is cyclical, like in construction and in fact.
It's amazing how, like, the connection, something that was very, very useful to me as a reader in the book, the connections you make between specific drugs and specific sounds, and how, one drug changes to another drug, and that's when the scene takes this drastic downturn.
Right, yeah. It's my job as a storyteller to make that simple, and of course it's not always quite that simple, but it kind of is. When cocaine basically takes over from MDMA in New York, and it isn't just New York, you do hear that change in the music. The sort of oceanic gushiness of super club trance and filter house in the late 90s. If you think of a record like You Don't Know Me by Armand Van Helden, where it's just like this filtered loop and singing over it, a lot of the big beat that was really popular then had an enormous sound. The tracks would be 8-9 minutes long. You think of the Private Psychedelic Reel at the end of Dig Your Own Hole. Like it's late 60s style mind expansion music, and not just on the drug level, but on the let's throw it all at the wall, let's really go for it. And that had turned kind of into trance. Trance was that was as close as it got in America to commercial pop in the late 90s, aside from something like the Chemical Brothers or Fatboy Slim. So that was the closest it came in the States to crossing over as dance music, as a thing unto itself. But when around 2001, and this is even before 9/11, you're just starting to see people are sick of it. They want songs again. They want something stripped down, and it just fits the time better. Like that late 90s never-ending sense of prosperity just couldn't last.
Yeah, and that's something that comes up. Cyclical is a perfect word. Something about the way you tell this story that really blew my mind was the way all these different, like, scattered scenes will go through over and over again. The thing of all the work of putting it together, and then it'll come crashing down, and other kids in another town having to start from scratch. I guess the lack of continuity between scenes is really remarkable through the book.
Right. When I spoke with Paul Van Dyke for the book, I talked to him for a half hour. Very nice guy. Perfectly friendly the whole time. Spent most of our 30 minutes together arguing with me about what I was doing, because according to him, EDM has absolutely nothing to do with rave. Literally, they're not the same thing. And I said, I know that, but in America, it's the same people. The same people are putting on these parties. Like, the people who put on the big EDM festivals are the people who were putting on raves 20 years ago, and he wouldn't hear it. It was too different for him. Yeah, and I think that's understandable. Like, if you're in that, particularly as somebody who isn't American, and that's very much the point too, is that this is a very specifically American story. Berlin and London figure into it only insofar as they touch America in a way, as they sort of help direct the course of America. Berlin comes in a couple of times. It has a fairly deep musical connection with Detroit through Tresor, which puts out a lot of the underground resistance related stuff and other things as well in the early to mid 90s. And then in the mid 2000s, that's where, because there's no scene left in America. There's literally nothing left. The parties that in New York in the mid 1990s could attract 10,000 people, you couldn't do that anymore. You were lucky if you got 300 people to the basement of a club. It had fallen apart. And so Berlin is where everybody went. Not everybody, but a lot of people. If you were still, in 2003 to 2006, if you were still an American techno DJ, producer, and you wanted to make a living, and you didn't want to have to go and get a job and sell insurance, Adam X had to do that. Todd Edwards ended up answering phones for Verizon, I think. He ended up doing telemarketing, which is really funny to think about now, because Todd Edwards is the co-producer of Get Lucky, and he's up there with Daft Punk at the Grammys last year, accepting the Album of the Year award because he helped make it. This is less than a decade after he had to start answering phones for a living because there was just no demand for what he did, and he wasn't going to move to Berlin. But if you were a techno person, if you were somebody who programmed for a living and made dance music on the side or DJ'd at night or whatever, you could move to Berlin with very few strings, live incredibly cheaply, and as long as you weren't making your living from Berlin firms, you could live there on an artist work visa.
It seems like the way you describe the Berlin and the European sort of culture in general is so different from just the North American, I guess, the classic pop scenario of being stuck in a town and dreaming of these super glamorous, faraway places.
Yeah, it became more porous.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of the people who were they didn't have to dream of Berlin. It was actually cheaper to live in Berlin because you couldn't necessarily do that in a smaller town. You wanted an audience. As the scene collapsed or was made to collapse, there was no audience, even in the bigger towns in America. Again, you think of New York, and you think of the Bunker, which started I think 12 years ago now, 13 years ago, and that was in the basement of Tonic. That was the big dance party in New York, was that party in Subtonic, which could hold maybe you could stuff 200 people in there if you used a lot of margarine. But yeah, it was gone. Even though and what I saw happening was around 2006, I started to hear from various friends, some of whom were writers and some of whom were not, this is happening again, creatively. It had gone away from that slough, that the minimal techno of the mid-2000s had just kind of gone down the drain a little bit in terms of quality and in terms of inspiration. It just started to get rote. But then people started rediscovering techno again, old techno, and they started to make that again. It was becoming sort of a retro moment. There was this whole let's blow the whole kit up and start over again because we don't really have a mass audience anyway feeling about it. They could play. And to me, 2006 to 2010 is one of the great dance music epochs. It's equal to the 90s for me. And most of that is not the stuff that's in the book or the stuff that got huge. So when the stuff got huge, I thought, oh good, the stuff I like is going to get huge. No, it was the stuff I'd avoided.
But you did something I remember when you had your top 10 singles list a couple years ago, and you had Bangalang on it. Is that what it's called? Bangarangalang?
Bangarang by Skrillex?
Yes.
Yes.
And I was so excited when I saw that on your list, and I was like, oh, it was a relief. I was like, oh, good. I'm glad
great
this is okay to like.
I felt the same way when I heard it. It was like, oh, this is actually good.
Okay, I heard that song, and I was like, is this not 1996?
Right, it's the Chemical Brothers.
Yes, it's totally the Chemical Brothers. It's not even
like
third
the
album Chemical Brothers.
Right, no, it's like giddy early first 2 album Chemical Brothers.
Yes.
It's like Dust Brothers Chemical Brothers before they changed their name because the hip-hop producers send a cease and desist.
For this like very specific kind of sound to be just completely ubiquitous, it has to be disorienting even for people who haven't been listening very long.
Kind of, but I mean,
Someone with your roots in the history.
sure, but that track, that's a no-brainer. You know, of course that track.
Never know.
That's true, but I mean, it's a no-brainer the same way that "Defunk" by Daft Punk is a no-brainer. It's like, this is a great record. Like this hits all the marks. It's attempting to do these things and it's succeeding at them. You know, and that's as somebody who really did not love a lot of the other Skrillex stuff that I had heard at that point. And I've gone back and a lot of it does sound better in retrospect. And that's true of any kind of pop, right? Like the way pop works is you hear it a lot and then you decide how you feel about it. Sure. Right? It hits you, it comes to you. Pop comes to you. The stuff that I like in dance music is typically the stuff that I go to. It isn't always the stuff that comes to me because it just works in a different way. And frankly, dance music, it is sensation-based, so the more subtle it is, and if it's subtle and still sensation-based, that's what I like a lot. I like that combination of things. But in terms of it being pop, I've never had a problem with dance music being pop, unlike a lot of people. A lot of dance music people do not want their music to ever be pop, the way that a lot of hip-hop people don't, or a lot of indie rock people don't. That was the mid-'90s. It was all these like style wars over who was keeping it realer or realist. And dance music was certainly part of that. It was funny, there was a book, David Barker and Hugh Taylor wrote a great book a number of years ago called Faking It. And it's a history of, not even a history, it's a study of what is and isn't real in pop music. And I love that book except for the last chapter, which is where they fell off a cliff, and I've told David this. And so I'm not just like talking here. I explained this to him. It's about Moby. And what he says specifically is, play was a triumph, but of course it was, because in disco, phony is okay. There is no such thing as real. And I'm like, you do not know the first thing about the economy of dance music and realness. If you are using the wrong machine in a dance track, you're not keeping it real. And that's not a joke. There are people who will like ding you for it.
The word realness itself.
Right.
It's a disco word.
Yes, exactly. You make me feel mighty real.
Yeah.
Yeah, and real does not mean necessarily the same thing as it does in rock or in other kinds of music.
Yeah, but it's funny how like specifically like the realness wars or style wars, which in dance music are often realness wars. You mentioned the mid-'90s. I remember there was this popular put down in the mid-'90s, Handbag.
Oh yes, Handbag House. Handbag House was basically high energy, derived house music, a lot of vocals, a little tatty, and it was called Handbag because it was a completely sexist term. It was because that was what the women allegedly did on the dance floors. They put their handbag down and dance around it. Hence Handbag House.
Kind of amazing, and like hugely popular. Like around the time that M People won the big English award,
and I love that record. FYI, I really do like. I like those first couple of M People records a lot because of course, in dance music, the idea, like for people who hate that stuff, is it's not Richie Hawtin. Well, I don't want it to be Richie Hawtin. I have Richie Hawtin.
It was. I remember the Chris Gower review of that album, and I know you do
Yes.
too, which really nailed it on the head. He was like, this is, this is better than the Yaz album that tried to do this.
Right.
Like,
Right. It's operating on a different level. One of the chapters that's not in the book is sort of a ghost in the book. I concatenated parts of it, and I kind of wish I'd had space to go into it more, but it did. I wanted to keep that rhythm, and it was about the 1993 Winter Music Conference. And the reason I wrote about that is because that's around the time that the club-based house approach, which is very song-oriented, really moved away from the tracks-based rave approach, for lack of a more involved term. And it had this great quote, the epigraph. I really wish I'd managed to get it in there. And it was from the Any Raves list, and it was about a party at the Limelight in 1994, about the lineup, and it was some kid writing, David Morales? I thought this was supposed to be a rave. Like, it was super factionalized by that point.
Is it weird that this music, so traditionally like wrought by factionalism and be true to your schoolism, that it has become this huge uncontrollable pop, like?
In a way, yes, but also the stuff that has become the huge uncontrollable pop juggernaut is not the stuff that that I came up on. And I don't mean that just in the sense that it's different people in a different time. I don't think this stuff, if some equivalent of this had occurred in 1995 and still bore a similar relationship to the more underground stuff, it still would not be the same. It's really funny to look back at the way that Moby got pilloried in the mid-90s by the rave scene, because he was basically trying to take rave tricks and turn them into pop songs. And that's essentially what a lot of the EDM producers have done. But they've done it with a lot less style, I would say, overall. But, there's exceptions to everything. Skrillex is one. My favorite track this year. So what's really fascinating to me right now is that EDM proper, they're all going Balearic. They're all playing this stuff that they call tropical. My favorite track this year is by Eshe Palante, which you might remember as not the artist. The term is, what's her name from Drag Race last season.
Seriously?
Yes, it's not the person from it. It's the name Eshe Palante is the catchphrase of Yara Sofia.
Okay.
So the track is called A Discussion Between Saxes. And as my friend Chris Malamphy put it, Spirit of 86. It is shameless.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that kind of they're calling it tropical now because it's got all of these flamenco guitars and sax solos. So it's really funny the way that the EDM generation is taking phrases like that, like tropical, which has a whole other connotation in sort of underground dance music where it typically means it sounds African or Brazilian, and applies a different meaning to it. They're doing the same thing with the term deep house. In dance music history, deep house means very gospel, R&B, jazz rooted, very black sounding, or
One man.
or The Wanderer by Romanthony.
Yeah.
Or even like a European act like Luomo, which is, a very Euro dubby glossy version of that kind of a deep house record. For EDM kids, deep house means post-disclosure.
Wow.
Yeah, it means Maya Jane Coles, and I think I understand the reason. I mean, and God, correct me if I'm wrong, but my strong sense is that deep means not shallow. Period. And but again, I think there is a big difference in the way that people are using these terms, because there hasn't been anything like this book where you have some idea of what the connections are.
Sure.
Those are hard to trace unless you kind of roll your sleeves up and do the work, and that's not always easy to do. And I think that's kind of becoming true generally of younger music listeners overall, as the sort of narrative thread that you or I take for granted as part of the sort of pop fabric basically breaks.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting just that the way stuff comes out. Did you like the Vic Mensa record?
I haven't heard it.
The Down in My Luck, like from like a year.
Okay, keep in mind that because I was writing this book, I was kind of on vacation from new music for a
It's
few
the one
years.
that sounds exactly like Good Life.
Oh, well, then I probably love it, right?
It's an extraordinarily Detroit sounding, but like by someone, needless to say, who is not alive for any of that stuff. And it's just like, it was mind blowing to me that this was something that was like popular with like kids in my life and kids in my neighborhood, and like, and that's something that had, you know, that this like teenage MC had done this real like.
But that's not altogether unusual, because when you look at Zalia Banks, for instance, she's using tracks by Lone. And Lone is one of my favorite producers. He's from Nottingham, and he basically makes records that sound like old rave records, like on purpose. Like that's his MO. He's made like 4 or 5 really terrific albums. My favorite is Emerald Fantasy Tracks is like just one of the great albums of the last 10 years to me. I can play that record all day. And everything on it is just super like early 90s house and hardcore. Just really a wonderful record. But yeah, and she's using his, you know, she uses his tracks to rhyme over. And you see more and more of that too. You see a lot more of that kind of old school sound that's making its way back in.
We are unfortunately running a little bit low on time for the evening, so I did want to check in with the audience to see if you guys have any questions for Michaelangelo, any comments, any stories of your own. Ready? Okay, we got 2.
Hi, Matos. So I always thought of you as, maybe you said you didn't feel like you were in the center of these scenes that were going on. I always thought of you as, I always went to you as like the expert in this stuff, because I know nothing about this music,
Right.
and you always knew, to me, everything about it. What did you learn? Like, what surprised you when you were writing this stuff? Like, what blew your mind the most?
One persistent thing would be when I would start talking to somebody about one event or 2 things that I knew they were involved with, and find out that they were in fact involved with 6 or 7 different things I was writing about. That happened all the time. Like all the time. And it wasn't because I was lazy and didn't look. It's because the same people pop up over and over again as a matter of course within like all of these scenes, because they're connected. I mean, one thing that I'll say that is a little bit silly for dance music to do is to that's a whole other scene than that. And it's like, but it's the exact same people. You know, somebody like John Selway, who's a really good example. He was one of the first New York techno producers, and then he put out Fisher Spooner's first 12-inch. So he's involved in electroclash. A lot of electroclash was old techno guys. Larry T had been at the Limelight. He had co-founded which one? Disco 2000. He had been involved in all sorts, he'd co-written Supermodel. He'd done all kinds of things over the years, and that was just another wrinkle of it. Electroclash was sort of his like grab for the brass ring in some respects. This is my claim. I'm gonna like put my stake down on this and really like devote myself to this sound, to this as a new wrinkle on that scene. But it was the same people, and I think it helped me a lot. Definitely helped me like carve a through line. The other thing, and I've said this before, and it sounds more glib than I intend it to be, but I was genuinely surprised to find out how genuinely important Steve Aoki was. Because Steve Aoki, Steve Aoki's whole public image is, cake throwing moron. He's not a moron at all. He's a sharp guy. He was actually like one of the people who brought the whole electro thing to LA in a serious way. He was playing mashups and hip hop in clubs, and then he like got religion at Daft Punk at Coachella, and boom, turned it around. And him and DJ AM and a few other people in Los Angeles, and really like that's where the EDM boom kicks off. He's a very, very important person to that. So that was genuinely surprising. Hi, Todd.
Hi, Michaelangelo.
Thanks for
All
the
right.
photos.
You're welcome. So, how do I say this?
Okay, let's have it. Say it to me like I'm 5.
No. Well, just to clear the air, I am one of the contributors to this book. I did a bunch of photos for Michaelangelo for this, but I did want to say, first off, I read this book faster than any book I've ever read in my entire life, mainly because it's like Pee Wee Herman at the end of the film where he's like, I don't need to see the film Dottie, I lived it, and that's very much like this. What he wrote about is exactly like my coming of age, like out of high school, going into raves immediately, and like everything he mentions, I was pretty much either 2 years or directly involved with. But
Right.
there's a point when you wrote about Music Institute, I actually started like crying. When you describe Derek May's last song being Pacific, which actually ties into the whole like appropriation of names and new genres of house music, that song specifically is the one that got me into like making this stuff. I mean, I had been into like Nucleus and Kraftwerk and all that other stuff, but Pacific was the one thing I saw on MTV like in 89 or 90 in which it's like
It just spoke to you in a totally different way.
yeah, but it was also, you could see people, I'd never seen anybody like banging on a keyboard like they were a guitar. And when they played like Cubic at some rave in 89 or 90, and MTV's 120 Minutes showed it, that was just like, you could put the two things together and you actually like, for me it was like almost like a rite of passage. Seeing like Derek playing that song and it being my entry point into this whole thing was like pretty magical. A side note, the loon sample used on that is actually a North American bird that they appropriated and tried to give it the idea that it's a tropical house song, which Pacific has all those elements of like, you know, saxophone
Oh,
and
sure,
stuff
yeah.
that, you know, basically like yacht rock for house music.
Yeah, totally.
So the question is, what's been the blowback, considering that most people that are true heads would think that you just completely glossed over it, and I can say that, you know,
Oh, of
from a
course.
personal standpoint, that you,
what
I
have I
knew that
glossed
that
over
book was
exactly?
not about that. It was about how did this thing become big.
Right, but what specifically has been glossed over in this formulation?
Nothing specifically. It's just that the
How do I
the
deal with
exact,
how do I deal with
all
the
right,
heads blowback?
I should say specifically, you went from like this giant gap from like 94 to 2000 in that time frame.
I don't know if I did that.
All right, you okay? From my particular standpoint, it felt like it went like just a really sharp upturn towards just the biggest events, and I would say that like, I don't know if the people in the scene necessarily experience it as such. I'm not saying it's incorrect.
No, I think I understand what you mean, which is I didn't go full on day to day in the latter half of the 90s the way I did in the first half.
Yeah,
and
it was
that's
like
because
kind of
right, and that's because the
top
first
heavy.
half of the 90s is the world building part.
Right.
And that was what I was concerned with. I was concerned with the different aspects of world building that led to what's going on now. So, yeah, I mean, you know, most of my party going was in the mid to late 90s too, and if that was, it wasn't hard to cut that. It was like part of what, you know, originally I thought, oh, I'm going to write a book about the 90s. I didn't think I was going to write about the 80s or about the 2000s or anything at all. I thought that the book was, when I started this, I thought the book was going to end with the RAVE Act. And then I was talking to Peter Orlov, and he said, well, of course you can sell your book. Just put EDM in the title. And I was like, you idiot, of course that's what you're going to do. Why didn't you think of that? You're stupid. So that, and the first 2 chapters were not meant to be chapters. They were meant to be a short preface. And then I realized, oh, no one knows any of this here. I cannot just say Acid House happened and have a nation understand. Nobody in America understands. Like in, you know, outside of the people that can fill a certain sized nightclub, no one in America knows this stuff. So you have to explain it, and it's irresistible to explain. The early Detroit and Chicago, as you well know, is some of the most romantic easy to romanticize stuff there is in music. You know, it's these teenagers who are creating the future and having fun at the same time. That's irresistible. But I wanted very much to focus on the stuff that was, and frankly, it may well be that I concentrated so much on the early part of the 90s because it was right before I got into it, so it has more of a hold on me. I certainly thought I would do more day-to-day, scene-to-scene stuff in the latter half of the 90s, and once I got, and I wrote a lot, you know, I mean, the chapter drafts were, as some people here are aware, monstrous. You know, the Electric Daisy Carnival chapter, there's a 30,000 word version of that draft. The Electroclash chapter has a 20,000 word version that I'm actually really proud of and would love to see published whole someday. But, you know, the second half of the 90s, I wasn't writing about the scene as much. I was writing about the business. And I think the signal for that really is where we go from Rave America to right in the next chapter, Gary Richards starts to work at American Recordings, and that takes us into the biz. That's the jump. That's very much the jump, and that's very much on purpose, because at a certain point it becomes about the business rather than about the fans, because at first the fans are the business, and then the business becomes a business.
Awesome. Well, we are out of time for our conversation this evening. On behalf of Strand, Michaelangelo, and Rob, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you guys for coming out, too. Let's give them another round of applause. Thank you.